The gunshot echoed through Red Creek's dusty main street like thunder, and Jack Morrison knew his luck had finally run out. Blood trickled from his split lip as he stumbled backward from the saloon's swinging doors, his opponent's smoking revolver still pointed at his chest. The bullet had missed by inches, embedding itself in the wooden post behind him, but the message was crystal clear. "Next time you try to cheat at my table, cowboy, I won't miss," snarled Big Jim Cartwright, his massive frame filling the doorway. The saloon had fallen silent except for the nervous shuffling of boots and the distant sound of a player piano that had stopped mid-song. Jack's hands trembled as he raised them slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs like a caged animal. "I wasn't cheating, Jim. You know that." Jack's voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. His brown eyes darted around the crowd of onlookers, searching for a friendly face, but found only cold stares and turned backs. In a town like Red Creek, accusations of cheating stuck to a man like tar, whether they were true or not. Cartwright's laugh was as cold as winter rain. "Maybe, maybe not. But you still owe me $300, and seeing as how you don't have it." He gestured toward Jack's horse, a beautiful chestnut mare named Belle, tied to the hitching post. "I'll be taking that pretty horse of yours, along with that fancy saddle and everything else you got." Jack's stomach dropped like a stone thrown into a well. Belle wasn't just transportation, she was his partner, his friend, the only thing in this world that had never let him down. He'd raised her from a foal, trained her himself, shared more meals and cold nights with her than with any human being. The thought of losing her made his chest tighten with panic. "Please, Jim. Not Belle. Take my gun, my boots, hell, take the shirt off my back, but not my horse." Jack's voice cracked with desperation. He could feel the weight of every eye in that street pressing down on him like a physical thing. Women had stopped their shopping to stare, children peeked around their mothers' skirts, and the other cowboys watched with the sort of morbid fascination usually reserved for public hangings. "Should have thought of that before you sat down at my table with empty pockets," Cartwright replied, holstering his weapon with deliberate slowness. "Boys, untie that horse and bring her around back. The saddle and gear too." Two of Cartwright's men moved toward Belle, and Jack felt something inside him break. He lunged forward, but strong hands caught his arms, holding him back. "Don't make this harder than it has to be, Morrison," one of them muttered. "Jim's being generous letting you walk away breathing." Jack watched helplessly as they led Belle away, her hooves clopping against the hard-packed earth with a sound that felt like nails being driven into his coffin. She looked back at him once, her dark eyes confused and trusting, and Jack had to bite his tongue to keep from crying out. Everything he owned in this world was disappearing around the corner of that building, and there wasn't a damn thing he could do about it. "You got 1 hour to get out of my town, Morrison," Cartwright called from the saloon doorway. "And if I ever see your face around here again, we'll finish what we started today." The crowd began to disperse, their entertainment over, leaving Jack standing alone in the middle of the street with nothing but the clothes on his back and the bitter taste of defeat in his mouth. The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly, turning the dusty street into a furnace, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled as if mourning his loss. Jack reached into his vest pocket with shaking fingers and pulled out his last $3.47. Not enough for a room, barely enough for a meal, and certainly not enough to buy passage to anywhere that mattered. He was stranded in the middle of nowhere, with no horse, no gear, and no prospects. As he stood there, a small Mexican boy approached cautiously, his bare feet silent on the dirt. "Senor," he whispered, glancing nervously toward the saloon, "my mama, she work in the general store. She say to tell you there is a wagon train leaving for Tucson in 2 days. Maybe you can work for passage, see?" Jack looked down at the boy's earnest face and managed a weak smile. "Thank you, son. That's mighty kind of your mama." He pressed 50 cents into the boy's palm, half of what he had left in the world. "You tell her Jack Morrison said thank you." The boy's eyes widened at the unexpected generosity, and he scampered away clutching the coins. Jack watched him go, then turned his face toward the desert that stretched endlessly beyond the town's borders. 2 days was too long to wait, not with Cartwright's men watching his every move. He'd have to try his luck on foot, find some work at one of the distant ranches, maybe catch on with a cattle drive heading north. He stopped at the general store and spent his remaining money on a small bag of jerky, 2 cans of beans, and a half-empty canteen that the storekeeper sold him out of pity. It wasn't much, maybe 3 days' worth if he was careful, but it would have to do. The desert was unforgiving, but Jack had crossed it before, and he was still breathing. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded him painfully of Belle's coat, Jack walked to the edge of town and looked back one last time. Red Creek sat like a cluster of weathered bones in the vastness, its few lights beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk. Somewhere behind those buildings, Belle was probably being fed and watered by her new owner, already forgetting the man who had loved her. Jack turned away and began walking into the desert, his boots crunching on the gravelly sand. The temperature was already dropping as the sun disappeared, and by morning it would be cold enough to freeze a man's breath. But Jack Morrison had been cold before, had been hungry before, had been alone before. What he'd never been was truly broken, and he wasn't about to start now. The first night was hell. Jack found shelter behind a cluster of creosote bushes and wrapped himself in his thin jacket, listening to the haunting calls of coyotes and the rustle of unseen creatures in the darkness. He allowed himself a small portion of jerky and a few sips of water, knowing he had to make his supplies last as long as possible. By the second day, his lips were cracked and his tongue felt like leather. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, a sea of sand and scrub punctuated by the occasional saguaro cactus standing like a sentinel against the blazing sky. Jack's boots had developed holes that let in sand and small stones, and each step was becoming an exercise in willpower. It was on the third day, as the sun reached its merciless peak and Jack began to wonder if he would ever see another human being, that the sandstorm hit. It came out of nowhere, a wall of brown fury that turned day into night and transformed the air itself into something solid and choking. Jack pulled his hat down low and pressed his bandana over his nose and mouth, but the sand found every gap in his defenses, filling his eyes, his ears, his throat. He stumbled forward blindly, one hand stretched out in front of him, until his fingers touched solid rock. Following the stone wall by feel, he found what seemed to be a narrow opening and squeezed himself inside just as the storm reached its full fury. The wind howled like a living thing outside his shelter, and Jack pressed himself against the back wall of what appeared to be a small cave, grateful to be alive. It was then, as his eyes adjusted to the darkness, that he heard the sound that would change everything. It was soft, barely audible above the storm's rage, but unmistakably human. A child's quiet sob, filled with despair so profound that it cut through Jack's own misery like a knife. Jack froze, his heart suddenly racing. He wasn't alone in this cave, and in Apache territory, that could mean death. But as his eyes strained against the darkness, what he saw wasn't warriors or war paint. Instead, huddled in the deepest corner of the cave like a cluster of frightened rabbits, were 3 small figures that couldn't have been more than children. The storm raged on outside, but inside that cave, time seemed to stop as Jack Morrison stared at 3 pairs of dark eyes that reflected his own desperation back at him. They were Apache children, he was certain of that, but they were also something else that transcended any barrier of race or culture. They were hungry, they were scared, and they were dying. The smallest one, a girl who couldn't have been more than 6 years old, held a piece of leather in her mouth, chewing it desperately for any trace of nourishment it might provide. Her eyes were sunken, her cheeks hollow, and her tiny frame seemed to be holding on to life by the thinnest of threads. The boy beside her was perhaps 8, his proud bearing suggesting he was trying to be strong for his companions, but Jack could see the tremor in his hands, the way his chest rose and fell with the shallow breathing of someone whose body was beginning to shut down. The third child, a girl of perhaps 10, watched Jack with an intelligence that was both heartbreaking and unsettling. She said nothing, but her eyes held a question that needed no words. What would this white man do now that he had found them? Would he help them, or would he leave them to die alone in this cave while he saved his own skin? Jack's hand moved instinctively to the small bag of supplies at his belt. 2 cans of beans and a few strips of jerky. It was all he had left, barely enough to keep him alive for another day, certainly not enough to share. The rational part of his mind, the part that had kept him breathing through 34 years of hardship and disappointment, screamed at him to leave. These weren't his children, this wasn't his responsibility, and he had his own survival to worry about. But as he looked into those 3 pairs of eyes, Jack Morrison discovered something about himself that he hadn't known before. When it came right down to it, when the chips were down and the stakes were life and death, he simply couldn't walk away from children who were starving. Not even to save his own life. Moving slowly so as not to frighten them, Jack reached into his bag and pulled out one of the precious cans of beans. The sound of the metal opener breaking the seal seemed to echo through the cave like a gunshot, and all 3 children tensed, their eyes fixed on his hands with an intensity that made his chest tighten. He opened the can completely and set it on the ground between them, then pulled out his small spoon and took a single bite. The beans were cold and had a metallic taste, but they were food, and the children's eyes followed every movement of the spoon from can to mouth. Jack chewed slowly, deliberately, then held the spoon out toward the smallest girl. She looked at him for a long moment, then at the older children, as if asking permission. When they nodded slightly, she crept forward on hands and knees and took the spoon with trembling fingers. Her first bite was tiny, tentative, as if she couldn't quite believe this was really happening. But as the taste registered, she began to eat with the desperate hunger of someone who hadn't had a real meal in days. Jack opened the second can and divided it between the boy and the older girl, watching as they tried to eat slowly, to make it last, but ultimately surrendering to their body's demands. He shared his water with them too, knowing that dehydration was probably as dangerous as starvation in their condition. As the storm continued to rage outside, Jack found himself studying these children more closely. Their clothes were well made but worn, suggesting they came from a family of some standing within their tribe. The beadwork on the older girl's dress was intricate and beautiful, the sort of craftsmanship that took months to complete. These weren't orphans or outcasts, they were someone's beloved children, and someone, somewhere, was probably searching desperately for them. The boy finished eating first and sat back against the cave wall, his eyes never leaving Jack's face. When he spoke, his English was careful but clear, with only the slightest accent. "You are kind, white man. But why do you help us? Your people and mine, we are not friends." Jack considered the question seriously. It deserved an honest answer. "I reckon kindness doesn't have a color, son. And right now, we're all just people trying to survive a storm." The older girl spoke for the first time, her voice soft but carrying an authority that seemed beyond her years. "My grandfather always said that the measure of a man is not in how he treats his friends, but in how he treats his enemies when they are helpless." She paused, studying Jack's weather-beaten face. "You have proven yourself to be a good man. What are your names?" Jack asked, settling back against his own section of the cave wall. "I'm Jack Morrison." "I am Ayana," the older girl replied. "This is my brother Nailnish, and our cousin Desba." She gestured to each child in turn. "We were traveling with our grandmother to visit relatives when the soldiers came. There was shooting, running, people scattered in all directions. We became separated in the confusion and have been trying to find our way back to our people ever since." Jack felt a cold knot form in his stomach. "How long have you been out here?" "5 days, Nailnish answered, his young voice trying to sound brave. "Maybe 6. Time becomes strange when you are very hungry." 5 days. These children had been wandering the desert for 5 days with little or no food, and somehow they had survived. The fact that they were still alive was nothing short of miraculous, but Jack could see that their strength was nearly exhausted. Another day or two without food, and the desert would claim them. As the night wore on and the storm finally began to subside, Jack made a decision that he knew might cost him his life. He gave the children the last of his jerky, ignoring their protests, and shared the remainder of his water. By morning, he would have nothing left except the clothes on his back and whatever strength remained in his body. But as he watched Desba curl up against her cousin's side, finally able to sleep without the gnawing pain of hunger, Jack felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Peace. For the first time since Belle had been taken from him, he felt like he had done something that truly mattered. The dawn came quietly, filtering through the cave opening in pale shafts of light that revealed the full extent of their shelter. It was larger than Jack had realized, with ancient paintings on the walls that suggested it had been used by travelers for generations. The children were still sleeping, exhausted by their ordeal but looking more peaceful than they had the night before. Jack stepped outside to assess their situation and felt his heart sink. The storm had changed the landscape completely, erasing familiar landmarks and covering the ground with fresh sand. He had no idea which direction led to safety, and without supplies, their chances of survival were slim to none. It was then that he heard the sound that made his blood run cold. Hoofbeats. Multiple horses, moving with the steady rhythm of experienced riders who knew exactly where they were going. Jack pressed himself against the cave wall and peered around the opening, his heart hammering in his chest. What he saw took his breath away. A line of Apache warriors sat motionless on their horses about 50 yards away, their faces painted for war, their weapons ready. They had found the cave, and they were waiting. At their head sat a man who could only be a chief, his bearing proud and commanding, his eyes fixed directly on the cave opening where Jack stood frozen. But it wasn't anger or hostility that Jack saw in those dark eyes. It was something far more complex, something that seemed to look right through him and see into his very soul. The chief raised one hand slowly, palm outward in what could have been either a greeting or a command to stop. Behind Jack, he heard the children stirring, and Ayana's voice, filled with joy and relief, called out a single word in Apache that needed no translation. Grandfather. Jack Morrison realized that his life was about to change forever, and there wasn't a damn thing he could do about it except face whatever was coming with the same courage he'd shown in that cave. He stepped fully into the morning light, his hands visible and empty, and waited to learn what price his act of kindness would demand. The chief's eyes never left his face as the old man slowly dismounted and began walking toward the cave, his warriors remaining motionless behind him like statues carved from stone. Each step seemed to echo in the desert silence, and Jack found himself holding his breath, knowing that the next few minutes would determine not just his fate, but the fate of 3 innocent children who had become more precious to him than his own life. The storm was over, but Jack Morrison's real test was just beginning. The silence stretched between Jack and the Apache chief like a taut rope ready to snap. Each footstep on the desert sand seemed to thunder in Jack's ears as the old warrior approached, his weathered face unreadable as carved granite. The morning sun cast long shadows across the landscape, and Jack could feel the weight of every pair of eyes watching this encounter, from the mounted warriors behind the chief to the 3 children who had emerged from the cave to stand beside him. Chief Nailnish was not what Jack had expected. The man was perhaps 60 years old, his silver hair braided with leather and feathers, his face marked by decades of desert sun and hard decisions. But it was his eyes that held Jack captive. They were intelligent, penetrating, and completely without fear. This was a man who had seen life and death, war and peace, and had learned to read the souls of men as easily as tracking deer across stone. The chief stopped just outside arm's reach and studied Jack for what felt like an eternity. When he finally spoke, his English was flawless, cultured even, with only the slightest accent to hint at his heritage. You are the man who shared his last food with my grandchildren. It wasn't a question, but Jack answered anyway. Yes, sir. I am. My name is Chief Nailnish of the Chiricahua Apache. These children, he gestured toward the 3 young faces peering around Jack's legs, are the most precious things in my world. They have told me what you did for them, how you chose their lives over your own survival. The chief's voice was measured, careful, as if he were weighing each word before speaking it. Jack swallowed hard, his mouth dry as dust. Any decent man would have done the same. A small smile played at the corners of the chief's mouth, but his eyes remained serious. You would be surprised, Mr. Morrison, how few men truly understand what decency means when their own life hangs in the balance. Tell me, what did you think would happen to you when you gave them your last food? The question hung in the desert air like smoke. Jack looked down at little Desba, who was clinging to his leg with surprising strength, then back at the chief. I figured I'd probably die out here. But I also figured that was better than living with the knowledge that I'd let 3 children starve when I could have prevented it. Chief Nailnish nodded slowly, as if Jack had confirmed something he already knew. My granddaughter Ayana tells me you lost everything in your town. Your horse, your possessions, your home. Is this true? Yes, sir. Bad luck at cards and worse judgment about who to trust. Jack's voice was steady, but he could feel heat rising in his cheeks. It wasn't easy admitting failure to a man like this. And yet, when you had nothing left but enough supplies to save your own life, you chose to save theirs instead. The chief began walking in a slow circle around Jack, his moccasins silent on the sand. This is what the Apache call, choosing the path of honor even unto death. It is the highest virtue a warrior can possess. Jack felt confused and increasingly nervous. This wasn't going the way he'd expected. He'd been prepared for anger, threats, maybe even a quick death if he was unlucky. He hadn't been prepared for what sounded almost like praise. I'm not a warrior, Chief. I'm just a cowboy who ran out of luck. Perhaps, the chief said, completing his circle and facing Jack once more. Or perhaps you are something else entirely. Something this world needs more of. He paused, glancing back at his warriors, who remained motionless as statues. Mr. Morrison, I have a proposition for you. Something that will solve both your problems and mine. The words hit Jack like a physical blow. A proposition. This was it, the moment the children had unwittingly predicted. But what could an Apache chief possibly want from a broke cowboy who couldn't even keep his own horse? I'm listening, Jack said carefully. Chief Nailnish gestured toward a flat rock nearby. Sit. This will take some time to explain. He called out something in Apache to his warriors, who immediately began setting up a temporary shade with practiced efficiency. Jack settled onto the rock, acutely aware that he was now completely surrounded by Apache warriors who could end his life with a single command from their chief. But strangely, he felt no immediate threat. If they had wanted him dead, they would have simply killed him. The chief sat cross-legged on the sand facing Jack, his posture relaxed but alert. Mr. Morrison, there is a trading post about 50 miles north of here, at a place called Bitter Springs. The owner is a man named Samuel Hartwell, a former cavalry officer who retired to the desert 5 years ago. He is one of the few white men in this territory who has always dealt fairly with my people. Jack nodded, vaguely familiar with the name. Hartwell had a reputation as an honest trader, rare in a business where cheating Indians was considered standard practice. Recently, Hartwell sent word that he wanted to propose something. A permanent trading arrangement that would benefit both our peoples. Food, medicine, and tools for us, in exchange for horses, hides, and safe passage for his supply wagons. It could be the beginning of real peace in this region. That sounds like a good thing, Jack said, though he still couldn't see where this was leading. The chief's expression darkened. It would be, except for one problem. There are men on both sides who profit from the current state of war. White men who sell guns and whiskey to renegade Apache, then claim bounties for Apache scalps they collect from peaceful villages. Apache warriors who have grown addicted to raiding and see any peace as betrayal of their fallen brothers. Jack was beginning to understand. So you need someone both sides can trust. Exactly. Someone who has proven he values Apache lives, but who can also speak for the white world. The chief stopped and fixed Jack with his penetrating stare. I want you to be my emissary to Samuel Hartwell. Not just to carry messages, but to help design and implement this trading relationship. Jack felt his mouth fall open. Chief, I'm flattered, but I'm nobody special. I can't even keep myself out of trouble, let alone negotiate between two peoples who've been killing each other for decades. Can't you? The chief's voice was gentle but firm. Mr. Morrison, yesterday you faced a choice between your own survival and the lives of 3 Apache children you had never seen before. You chose their lives without hesitation. That tells me more about your character than any reputation or position ever could. Jack looked around at the warriors, then back at the 3 children who had already changed his life simply by existing. What exactly would this arrangement mean? You would live at Bitter Springs, serving as a permanent liaison between Hartwell and my band. You would help ensure that trades are fair on both sides, that agreements are honored, that misunderstandings are resolved before they become conflicts. The chief's voice took on an almost paternal tone. In return, you would have a home, meaningful work, and the protection of both peoples. It sounded almost too good to be true, which made Jack immediately suspicious. And if I refuse? Chief Nailnish smiled, the first genuinely warm expression Jack had seen from him. Then you are free to go, of course. I would give you a horse and supplies to reach whatever destination you choose. The debt between us is already paid in full by your kindness to my grandchildren. Jack stared at the old warrior, trying to process what he was hearing. After losing everything, after preparing to die alone in the desert, he was being offered not just survival but purpose. A chance to be part of something bigger than himself, something that might actually matter. There's something else, the chief continued. Samuel Hartwell is dying. A lung sickness that the doctors say will take him within 6 months, maybe less. He has no family, no heir to inherit his trading post. He has been looking for someone to take over his business, someone who understands both worlds and can continue his work. The implications hit Jack like a landslide. Not just a job, but potentially ownership of a successful business. A chance to build something lasting, something important. Why would Hartwell trust me with something like that? Because I would recommend you, the chief said simply. Samuel Hartwell trusts my judgment above all others. If I tell him that you are a man of honor, that will be sufficient. Jack stood and walked to the edge of the shade, looking out at the endless desert that stretched toward the horizon. Yesterday, this landscape had looked like his grave. Today, it might be the foundation of a new life. He thought about Belle, probably being ridden by one of Cartwright's men right now. He thought about Red Creek, where his reputation was ruined forever. He thought about all the failures and disappointments that had brought him to that cave, broke and desperate and ready to die. Then he thought about 3 pairs of dark eyes watching him with hope and trust, about a chief who was offering him not just survival but significance. When he turned back to face Chief Nailnish, Jack's decision was clear. I accept your proposition, Chief. I'll do everything I can to make this work. The old warrior's face lit up with genuine pleasure. I thought you might. You have the look of a man who was meant for something more than drifting from town to town. As they prepared to leave for Bitter Springs, little Desba ran over to Jack and pressed something into his hand. It was a small carved stone, smooth and warm from her palm. For luck, she said in careful English. So you remember us. Jack knelt down to her level, his throat tight with emotion. I could never forget you, little one. You and your cousins saved my life just as much as I saved yours. As they rode toward Bitter Springs, Jack found himself thinking about larger questions. How had he gone from rock bottom to this incredible opportunity in the space of 24 hours? They crested a small rise and saw Bitter Springs spread out in the valley below. It was larger than Jack had expected, with a substantial trading post at its center, corrals full of horses, and several outbuildings that suggested a thriving operation. It could be yours someday, if you prove yourself worthy of Samuel's trust, the chief observed. But remember, Mr. Morrison, ownership brings responsibility. Jack Morrison rode toward his new life with his head held high, carrying in his pocket a small carved stone and in his heart the memory of 3 pairs of dark eyes that had seen something in him he was only just beginning to understand himself. Behind them, the cave where it all began was already being reclaimed by the shifting sands, but the consequences of that trust would ripple outward for generations.